Dave, Dr. Shock Becker here with what turned out to be part two of my look at the movies in my collection from 1980 to 1983. Again, just real quick, as I mentioned in the first video, this is not all of the movies that I own that were released between 1980 and 1983. These are just the ones that I put in this book. And I left off, last time what happened was my phone reached its limit of storage and stopped the video on me. I meant it all to be one continuous video, but it wasn't meant to be. Real quick, I left off on Jaws 3. I think I'd gone into it. It's about the older Brody, or the sons from the first two Jaws movies. The Brody children have grown up and they work at I guess it's a marina. And here comes the shark here comes a shark, and sharks seem to follow Brodies wherever they go. It's certainly not a bad film. It's just, a step below, in my opinion, the other two. And I know Jaws 2 is a step below the original, obviously. The original Jaws is a masterpiece, and Jaws 2, not quite that. But, and Jaws 3, I think, was even a step below Jaws 2. But it has its fans, and it's not a terrible movie by any stretch. Krull. I've only seen this movie once or twice, and I reviewed it. It was one of the first. I reviewed it in the first year on the blog, so it's been 10 years now because I started in 2010. But it's an 80s sort of fantasy sci-fi film, and I remember liking it quite a bit. This one I like more than quite a bit. It's Ladies and Gentlemen, the Fabulous Stains. It is about a rock trio of young women. I want to say teenagers. It has Diane Lane stars in it. I think she was 15 at the time. It has a young Ray Winstone in it. Laura Dern was also 15. She plays one of the band members. It was definitely inspired, I think, by the Runaways. And Lou Adler produced this film. It's a good rock movie. It is, and it tells a good story. It's got some good music in it. What's that one? A couple punk songs sung by the group that Ray Winstone fronts. I can't remember the name. There was one that the Professionals. I think was the name of his group. Anyway, that's one I would strongly recommend. Ladies and Gentlemen, the Fabulous Stains. Last American Version is the second of the three 1982 teen sex comedies released. It was originally an Israeli movie, and Canon Films, Golan Globus, brought it over here. They're the ones who released it in Israel. It was a major box office. I think it still might be one of the highest grossing movies in Israel of all time. And they just basically remade it here in America as The Last American Virgin. And it's entertaining. Now we come to one of my favorite movies of the 1980s in general, Local Hero, directed by Bill Forsyth, written and directed, I think, by Bill Forsyth. I watch this movie every year before I go away on vacation, and there's a reason for that. I mean, it's a story about an oil executive who is used to handling things on the phone in his office, and he's sent out to Scotland to buy a town. He has to buy the entire town. They want to build a refinery on the coast there, and he has to buy out the residents so they can knock it down. And some of these people have been there for generations and generations. Well, to his surprise, everyone's thrilled to sell. They want to get out of there. But he slowly falls in love with the place. And that's what this movie is about falling in love with a place away from home. And so every time, I love the beach. I've, mentioned that before on the podcast and whatnot. Whenever, the night before we're heading down on vacation to the Jersey Shore, I usually watch Local Hero just to put me in the mood. There's more to it. It also has Burt Lancaster in it. He plays a great role as the executive, the chief executive of the oil company. And there's a little side story about a woman who might or might not be a mermaid. There's a visit by a Russian who's friendly with the locals in this particular town, and him and Peter Riegert stars as he's the star. He's you know the one who falls in love with this little town of Furness in Scotland, and he strikes up a friendship with the Russian. Um, just a good movie. It really is. It's a great movie, and it really is about just falling in love with some place. It's yeah. I watch it at least once a year, every year. The Long Good Friday, an excellent British crime film, but it's funny. I'm reading a book right now called Very Naughty Boys, the untold story of Handmade Films. Handmade was the production company that George Harrison started to help Monty Python release The Life of Brian. And Monty Python could not get backing, or they got backing from EMI, and EMI backed out at the last minute, and they had already made all these commitments, so George Harrison bailed them out, and along with his partner Dennis O'Brien started Handmade Films. And the book is really interesting, but the first movies they put out were Life of Brian and Time Bandits, and then they came in and they stepped in and saved The Long Good Friday. It had been produced. The head of the studio that produced it didn't want to release it. He thought it glorified the IRA. He didn't want anything to do with it. The basic story is Bob Hoskins plays a crime boss in London who is trying to strike up a major deal with the mafia from America. And while he's doing that, these unforeseen forces are slowly trying to crumble his organization. They've murdered his best friend. They're blowing up his car, and he's not sure who it is, and he's trying to find out. He's trying to deal with that at the same time as put together this deal. Bob Hoskins is tremendous, but the studio really, the people behind it, they were going to make it a TV movie, and then they didn't know what to do with it. They were going to dub over Bob Hoskins' voice because they figured his accent was too thick for American audiences, and Bob Hoskins was going to sue them over it. It was just a very troubled history, this movie had a very troubled path to get to release, and Handmade stepped in and bought it and gave it a proper release, and did right by the movie, and it's one worth seeing. There was a time in the late 80s when The Long Riders, early 90s I guess, was one of my favorite films. I still really like it. I do now kind of recognize that it's about the James Younger gang, the Jesse James and the Younger brothers, and it tends to glorify the outlaws a little too much, to the point that Jesse James is almost like the second coming or something. So that's I found that it bothered me a little more later on when I saw it more recently. However, it is still a fantastic Western, and it's got an interesting little I guess. One of the interesting things that they did was they cast actual brothers to play brothers in this movie. You have Stacy and James Keach playing the James brothers. You have the three Carradines, David, Keith, and Robert, playing the Youngers. You have Dennis and Randy Quaid playing the Miller brothers, and Christopher Guest and his brother, can't remember what his name is now, play Bob and Charlie Ford. So that was kind of interesting, but other than that, it's a good Western. There's an awesome sequence during the Minnesota raid that the gang went on. It's some of it's shot in slow motion. It's a violent film, and that scene in particular is really something. There's some slow motion shots in there, and it's just like, wow, what, really impressive. Made in Britain, Alan Clark. I think this was a TV movie. Tim Roth, I think, might have gotten his start in this. It is not an easy movie to watch. Tim Roth plays a skinhead and a real son of a bitch. He really does. You really hate this guy throughout the movie. And it's not long. I think it's just a little over, maybe an hour, 10 minutes, something like that. But Tim Roth gives such a tour de force performance as this just total jerk. But again, and his performance is what really drew me to the movie, and it made me actually want to rewatch it. Another one talked about in the slashers. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, if you go out to Horror Movie Podcast, we did do a 4-part series on slashers. Greg Amortis, the host of Land of the Creeps, which I'm also a co-host on, joined us over on Horror Movie Podcast for that one. And, of course, I know we talked about Madman. That's, Madman Mars, and has a really fun song that sort of ends the movie. And you find yourself kind of humming it for days afterwards. Okay, The Man with Bogart's Face. This was a cable movie for me. It is about a guy who plays a private detective, and he looks like Humphrey Bogart. Robert Sachi, who was a professional Bogart impersonator, stars in the movie. It has Michelle Phillips, Olivia Hussey, Misty Rowe. Also, Yvonne DiCarlo is in this. Herbert Lom is in it. Franco Nero is in this movie. And it has, sort of shades of the qualities of the Maltese Falcon to it, and a few other Bogart films. When I watched it again for the blog in 2010, I was expecting that this was not going to hold up. It does. It is so good. It is a good, solid crime mystery. Robert Sachi does an excellent job as the lead, and he really does sort of embody Bogart. I can't recommend this one enough. The Man with Bogart's Face. I think, this is one maybe some of you haven't heard of. It was released under a different title as well, but yeah. Man with Bogart's Face. If you can track this one down, check it out. And The Man with Two Brains. Now, Steve Martin and Carl Reiner did 4 films together. This one, I think, this might have been the 3rd one. They did The Jerk, they did Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, then I think they did The Man with Two Brains, and then All of Me. All 4 of them are excellent, in my opinion. Well, not excellent. I think, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid is very good. It takes actual footage from 40s movies, black and white. It's a black and white movie with Steve Martin and Rachel Ward. He plays a detective, and they sort of edit in scenes with Bette Davis and Humphrey Bogart into the movie, so it looks like Steve Martin is interacting with them. That's Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid. The Man with Two Brains, though, is like a real zany. It's more along the lines of The Jerk. Really funny stuff. I saw this with my friends on cable. We could not stop laughing at this film, and I still think it's really funny. Maniac, one of the more notorious slasher films of the 80s. Joe Spinell stars in this one. Plays a killer who likes to scalp his female victims and put the scalps on mannequins, around his house. Really, people were really coming out against this movie. And one of the things on the Blu-ray that I like this release is it shows news footage and of protests and people coming out against this movie, and 2 of them are from news stations in Philadelphia. And I remember, it's funny watching those stations now. I remember when they looked like that. There's still, it's 3 main stations here are Channel 3, Channel 6, and Channel 10 are the ones that do like the 3 networks. ABC, CBS, and NBC. Channel 6 was always ABC. And it shows clips from Channel 6 News from back in 1980 when this movie came out, people protesting against it. But the movie itself really is strong, and I think it's one of my 10 favorite 80s slasher films. It's in my top 10, because Joe Spinell is just fantastic. Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. I remember sleeping over a friend's house and waking up one morning and watching something. I don't know what channel it was on, but it was about the making of Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. They were just getting ready to release the movie, and they did something of showing like behind the scenes of shooting the scenes where they're fish floating in a bowl and how they did that. This was not a handmade film. Monty Python had split. They had a sort of riff with Dennis O'Brien, George Harrison's partner in handmade films, and ended up, they didn't make this one for handmade. It was the first Python film since Life of Brian that was not released by handmade, or not that Monty Python made many movies, to be honest with you, but they talk about it in that book I had mentioned earlier. Some very funny sequences in this. Some you're never going to forget. Mr. Creosote, played by the late Terry Jones, who just passed away, who doesn't like to, but he pretty much destroys a restaurant. He's the richest man around. He's also the fattest man around. He's like 600 pounds and constantly vomiting. So this movie can challenge your gag reflex. And right before that, a guy donates his liver while still alive, and that's a pretty violent, gory scene, but it leads into a pretty cool musical number, Eric Idle's The Galaxy Song. Yeah, this is Monty Python. I do like everything they do, and I include The Meaning of Life in that. Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy. This is a Woody Allen movie. It's more of an ode to Ingmar Bergman's Smiles of a Summer Night, and it really does embody the summer season. I used to watch this the first day of summer vacation, just to put myself in the mood for the season. It's you know, the late nights. It's set in a really nice house out in the middle of the woods in New York, and it's a funny movie. It's got a good cast. Now Jose Ferrer is in this one, Julie Haggerty, Mary Steenburgen, Tony Roberts, Woody Allen, and Mia Farrow. This was the first Woody Allen movie that Mia Farrow was in, and it's lighthearted. It has a little tinge of fantasy to it, and I don't think, you know, it's a good movie. And like I said, it really puts you in the mood for the summer season. Missing was a critically acclaimed film, and it's excellent. Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek are searching. You know, his son goes missing, and it's her husband, and they get together to try and track him down in this. I can't remember what country it is, but there's like a sort of a revolution going on, and Costa Gavras, the first American film by Costa Gavras, and it's excellent. It really is. Mommy Dearest, yeah, Faye Dunaway as Joan Crawford. What can you say about Mommy Dearest? It's based on the book by Christina Crawford, sort of a damning book about life with her mother, Joan Crawford, the famous Hollywood actress. I do enjoy this movie probably more than I should. I think it's like sort of Hollywood sleaze, but I don't know. There's just something about it. Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears. I know this was nominated for Best Foreign Film one year at the Oscars, but I'll be honest, I haven't seen it yet, and it is on my list to watch soon. Mother's Day, the Troma original. Eli Roth's, according to this, favorite horror film. And yeah, I can see why. There's a lot to like about this Mother's Day. Roger Ebert gave it no stars, and he just said, I don't understand how people can enjoy this movie. Well, we do. And I am a big Roger Ebert fan. I really am. I have a lot of his books. Watching him in Siskel, I grew up watching them on TV, and he turned me on to a lot of great movies. But him and I just won't agree on horror, I guess, is what it amounts to. Or I never agreed with him when it came to horror movies. And Mother's Day, yeah, it's a Troma film. One little interesting tidbit: the house where Mother and her two sons live is in the middle of the woods in New Jersey. They got an actual abandoned house to shoot in, and while they were preparing it, they found the dead body of the previous owner in the closet. I guess the mummified dead body of its previous owner. He might have been murdered. I think he was. I'm not sure. I don't know whatever came of that, but they got the body out of there and shot the movie in the house anyway. Motel Hell. My co-host on Land of the Creeps, Greg Amortis. This is one of his all-time favorite films, and you can see why. It's Rory Calhoun. Gives such a cool performance in this movie, and it's about brother and sister who run a motel and a garden in the back. And we'll just leave it at that. It's worth seeing, and I think most horror fans may have, most fans of 80s horror are familiar with this. At least by the name, even if they haven't seen it. And if you haven't seen it, you really should. Charlton Heston's Mountain Man. I've always been a big fan of Charlton Heston. Not all of his movies, obviously, but this one I think is kind of underrated. I did enjoy The Mountain Man. Him and Brian Keith It's been a long time since I've seen it, but it's a Western with Charlton Heston. I mean, it's no Will Penny, which I think might be one of Heston's best films. But it's certainly not bad and it's worth a watch. Mr. Mom. Okay, I saw this in the theater because I was such a fan of Michael Keaton in Night Shift, the Ron Howard film. And this was his second movie. So I went and saw it in the theater. It's more of a romantic sort of comedy. Not a romantic comedy. It's probably not the right way to put it. It's a comedy, and Michael Keaton does a good job in it. He plays a slightly different character than he did in Night Shift. But yeah, it's an entertaining one. Terry Garr plays the wife. She goes off to work after he's laid off, so he stays home with the kids, and she becomes the breadwinner. And that's what the movie's about. It's a lot more common nowadays, but back in the '80s, that was especially the early '80s, that was not done often. That was not the norm. Let's put it that way. Miss 45, my choice for Abel Ferrara's best film. It's about a mute woman who works in the fashion industry. She is raped twice within a 6-hour time period, once in an alley and once in her home by 2 different men, and it sends her over the edge and she becomes a vigilante. And the movie's violent. It's promoted as exploitation, but there's so much more going on here than just simple exploitation. There really is. I think it's Abel Ferrara's best film. And my favorite slasher of the 1980s, My Bloody Valentine. We talked about this. I talked about this in my top films of the 1980s on Horror Movie Podcast. That's horrormoviepodcast.com. Check out the icons on the right side of the page, and I'm sure you'll come across our slasher episodes as well as our top movies of the 1980s episode. And I discussed this. It is my favorite 80s slasher film. My Bodyguard. Yeah. I saw this when I was in 8th grade on cable TV, and I remember being scared to death. I'm like, my God, is that what high school is like? Do you really have guys like Matt Dillon who stick your head in a toilet with a turd floating in it? I even remember watching this Halloween night. We got back from trick-or-treating and watching this Halloween night one night. And again, I watched it whenever it was on. This is one of the first movies that I watched continuously on cable. And whatever part, I just picked it up and continued watching it. Matt Dillon is so good in it, but boy, did I think he was the biggest bastard in the world. And I think that changed finally with the Flamingo Kid. But that's how good of a performance he gives. And I also think... Adam Baldwin is excellent as the bodyguard, as Chris Makepeace's bodyguard in this one. My Dinner with Andre. I have never seen this movie in its entirety, but so many people have just lauded. The critics love this film. I think it made Roger Ebert's top 10 of the 80s. Was it on his top 10 of all time? It's about 2 guys sitting down having dinner, and they said you wouldn't think the movie would be as interesting as it is, and from what I understand, it's a fascinating movie. Here's one I saw in the theater, my favorite year. It has an interesting backstory. Mel Brooks used to write for a TV show in the 50s called Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows. I think that's what it was called. I think it was called Sid Caesar's. Maybe it wasn't Your Show of Shows, but it was the Sid Caesar Show. And he wrote that with a lot of other, like Larry Gelbart and Carl Reiner, and I'm pretty sure Woody Allen was a young writer on that film towards the end. And at one point, Errol Flynn was going to be a guest. And Errol Flynn, of course, the star of Swashbuckling Adventures, but a real-life alcoholic. And Mel Brooks was tasked with making sure that Errol Flynn showed up to the live recording that night, in a state of sobriety. Well, this takes over from that. Mark Lynn Baker plays, I guess, what would be like the Mel Brooks character. He's a writer on this show, the King Kaiser. Instead of Sid Caesar, it's the King Kaiser show. King Kaiser played by Joseph Bologna. And Peter O'Toole plays the Errol Flynn role. And, it's funny. It's a funny movie. And Peter O'Toole was rightly nominated for an Academy Award for his performance here. But it's also dramatic. My favorite scene comes at the end when Mark Lynn Baker confronts Peter O'Toole, who says he cannot go out on the show because something, just personal reasons, and Mark Lynn Baker just confronts him on it, and they get in this argument, and it's just so well handled by both actors. It really is. And it leads to one of the greatest endings of a movie like this, in my opinion. It's awesome. And my favorite year. Check it out. National Lampoon's Vacation. I think Clark Griswold, that type of character, is the character that Chevy Chase was born to play. That eternal optimist, the guy who always sees, always, he's looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. Things never work out his way, yet he still stays upbeat. And then when finally things, he gets to his breaking point, he snaps in a big way to the point that you think he's going to kill somebody. That's the type. He is so good at that. He is so good at playing Clark Griswold in the Vacation movies. And he got to play a similar character in a very underrated late 80s movie. We'll get to that when I cover the movies of the later part of the 80s, called Funny Farm. I think Funny Farm was a funny movie. And Chevy Chase, again, plays that sort of eternal optimist. And the first Vacation and Christmas Vacation are the two best, but I really do love this first Vacation movie. There's so much to like about it. John Candy has a fun part in it, too, as a guard at Wally World. The Nesting. I haven't seen this horror film, but it was released by Blue Underground, and look at that artwork there. Makes me want to see it. The New York Ripper, a Lucio Fulci horror film. Probably, arguably his most notorious. It says the most controversial horror film ever made. It can certainly rank up there. It can rank up there with Cannibal Holocaust. I mean, you heard about, and if you haven't, you could certainly look it up, the video nasties where England was banning movies left and right for the violence. Well, this movie, they not only banned the New York Ripper, they threw it out of the country. They had the police escort the prince to the airport and watch them get on a plane and fly out of the country. It is a violent film. There's a guy, the killer has a voice like a duck. But it's classic Fulci, and I think it's one of his best films. I mean, this was definitely the period, the late 70s, early 80s, I think, is when Fulci was turning out his best work. Next of Kin. We talked about this in 2019. It was recommended by one of the listeners of Horror Movie Podcast, and it was in our listener pick episode where we discussed. I picked this one to watch, Next of Kin. It's an Australian film. I do remember seeing it covered in the great documentary, Not Quite Hollywood, The Wild Untold Story of Ozploitation. Australian exploitation films, and they covered this movie. It has a young John Jarratt in it, and it's truly excellent. But I'd recommend going back to that episode. And in our recent 2019, the Best of 2019 episode on Horror Movie Podcast, we discussed what classic films we saw for the first time in 2019 that we most impressed with. I had mentioned the Giallo film, Your Vice is a Locked Door and Only I Have the Key. And Josh had mentioned this one, based on when we discussed it, and he saw it and really liked it. And he reminded me of this one. I had completely forgotten about it. And then I said, yeah, you know what? I made it a tie with Your Vice is a Locked Door. It's that good. It really is. Night Crossing, a little bit of a story behind this, and I haven't seen the movie yet. I talked about how my neighbor took me to see my third viewing of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The only time I've seen 3 movies in the theater, and that was the third viewing. We got to the theater early, and they had a movie, more of a family-oriented movie, playing in that same theater beforehand. We were standing in the back as the last 5 minutes of this movie were playing, and I found out later it was Night Crossing. We didn't know what was going on, but at the very end, something happens, and the crowd erupted into this loud applause. I mean, they were like hooting and hollering. They loved the ending of this movie, and it must have been a great movie. Because I remember my neighbor going, wow, I really want to see that movie now. And I was like, yeah, me too. It's not as commonplace now to hear that type of applause, I guess, outside of Hollywood and outside of premieres. But man, that audience erupted in the last 5 minutes. They were so happy the way this movie ended. And I found out later there was Night Crossing. I haven't watched it yet, but I can't wait to see it, to see how well I remember those last 5 minutes. And a movie I just mentioned, Night Shift. Directed by Ron Howard. Henry Winkler and Michael Keaton play a couple of guys. They work the night shift at a morgue. and they end up using their facility as headquarters for a prostitution ring. They become pimps to help out Henry Winkler's neighbor, Shelley Long, at first, and they help all their friends, and they start making a lot of money doing it. Michael Keaton is a real revelation in this one. It was one of his first films, and he is so funny in this. He's so crazy. He is electric when he is on screen, and I think Henry Winkler does a good job as well. But when Michael Keaton is on screen, this movie just pops. I mean, if you haven't seen Night Shift, wow, you're missing something. And the same goes for Nighthawks. This was a cable movie for me. I don't think I've seen it since back in the 80s. Sylvester Stallone and Billy D. Williams play detectives in New York City who are trying to track down, who I believe, a terrorist played by Rutger Hauer. And it's so exciting. And again, Stallone gives just a great performance. I think he's an underrated actor. I really, really do. I talked about him in First Blood, how good he was. He's really good in Nighthawks also. And if you like that sort of gritty New York type of early 80s film, Nighthawks is one for you. All right, On Golden Pond. This was an Oscar winner from, the movies from 1981. Henry Fonda won for Best Actor. I think Jane Fonda was nominated as well. I think Katharine Hepburn won for Best Actress. It's Henry Fonda's last movie. So good. It's he plays a sort of grizzled old guy, and they go out to their vacation spot. Him and his wife, played by Katharine Hepburn, and their daughter Jane Fonda, visits them and leaves her stepson, I believe, or the son of her fiance, there for them to care for while Jane Fonda and her fiance Dabney Coleman go off on vacation. And it's about Henry Fonda connecting with this young kid, and it's just really, really good. And Jane Fonda and Henry Fonda don't have a great relationship, and the characters don't have a great relationship in this, and that sort of changes. It's an uplifting film and very well acted, and I used to watch it on HBO all the time. Sean Connery, Outland. I haven't seen this in years, but it's science fiction with Sean Connery. You can't go wrong. The Outsiders. Francis Ford Coppola directed this. It was an S.E. Hinton novel, I believe, starring a lot of the members of what they called the Brat Pack. C. Thomas Howell is the narrator of it, and Rob Lowe and Patrick Swayze play his older brothers. As you can see, Emilio Estevez is in this. It has Tom Cruise, Ralph Macchio, Matt Dillon has a major role in this film. Set in the 50s, the Greasers and the Socs, two gangs. And I guess you can sort of get, these are the Greasers. And Leif Garrett is in it. He plays one of the Socs. Socs, I guess that's how it's pronounced. Good movie. Really good movie. And again, Francis Ford Coppola. It's one of a couple S.E. Hinton novels he adapted. I think Rumblefish was the other one. Pieces, a early 80s slasher from Spain, I want to say. Extremely violent, a little goofy. There's a scene with martial arts that makes absolutely no sense. The producer just said, "Hey, martial art movies are popular now. Put in a scene with martial arts." Doesn't fit the story at all, makes no sense, and it's extremely racist the way it ends. It's not a great movie by any stance, but it is a great slasher movie, and it's got some, amazingly bloody gore in it. Pink Floyd, The Wall. Pink Floyd's The Wall is my all-time favorite rock album. I first came across it in 1979. At the same time, I discovered Sergeant Rock comic books and started playing Dungeons and Dragons. And let's just say that those three things nearly broke my little mind. And this movie conjured up the album in 1979 conjured up these images in my head. I just loved the way the music flowed. It's Roger Waters, sort of a semi-autobiographical rock opera. And I thought, man, when they made a movie, I said, I don't think the movie can match the imagery I had in my head. Alan Parker directed this. They managed to do it, and in some instances even go beyond that. An all-time great rock and roll film, and from one of the greatest albums ever made, based on one of the greatest albums ever made. The Plague Dogs, a British animated film. It says from the director of Watership Down. Now, if you thought Watership Down was depressing, Plague Dogs will make you want to open a vein. This movie is beyond depressing. It's about these two dogs who escape from a clinic where they're being used as test subjects. And you can see this little dog here has bandages on his head. His brain is exposed. They had been experimenting on his brain. That's the dog voiced by John Hurt. It's beautifully made. It really is, but it's not a movie. It's not in any way an uplifting movie. It's not a feel-good film. But if you like animation, if you were a fan of Watership Down, I think, the Plague Dogs is one you'd want to see. Popeye. Robert Altman's Popeye. I remember, to sum it up, Robin Williams made a quote when he got the role in Popeye as Popeye the Sailor. He said, "This is it, man. This is my Superman. I'm going into the stratosphere and I'm going to be a big star." He said after a few weeks of filming, he thought, well, maybe this isn't the movie. And he said after a month of filming, he was like, my God, when is this going to end? I saw it in the theater. I remember the father of one of my friends, a neighbor, drove all of us to the theater, dropped us off in Devon, PA, a theater. They used to have a 3-screen theater there. And I fell asleep. I fell asleep during the movie. And I did see it later on cable and enjoyed it a little bit more. I enjoy it more now. I like it more now than I did then. Still don't think it's one of Robert Altman's best, but Robin Williams is good as Popeye. The setting is really good in Malta, and the town of Sweet Haven, is it? Or I think that's what it's called. They really bring that to life, and Shelley Duvall, I think, was born to play Olive Oyl. I really think she was. Porky's, the third of the 1982 teen sex comedies. Siskel and Ebert despised this film. I really like it. I think it's funny. Set in the past. Bob Clark directed it. He's such an interesting director, going from Black Christmas to A Christmas Story to Porky's to what else did he do? Early on he did Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. Just a really interesting director. And this made a ton of money and led to several sequels. Private Benjamin I haven't seen since it was on cable in 1981. This was the movie that premiered the month I think we got cable. And Goldie Hawn, this is really her movie. She plays a young woman. She grew up. She's very rich. She marries a guy who dies on their wedding night of a heart attack, and then she's forced to fend for herself for the first time, and she decides to join the military. Doesn't go well at first, but it's one of those movies where she does eventually find herself. But Goldie Hawn is so good in this one. She was excellent. I don't know if she was nominated for anything for this, but she should have been. The Prowler, another one of my all-time favorite 80s slasher films. This one was shot in Cape May, New Jersey. I did visit one of the houses where many scenes were shot for this film. I saw it from the outside late one night. I didn't get to go inside. And for my money, Tom Savini's best effects work in a horror film of anything he's done, he did for The Prowler. I mean, you really think, you're like, these guys are dead. They have to be. They couldn't have survived this. These characters, that had to be a real killing. I mean, how did he do that? It's that good. The Prowler. Psycho 2, 1982, I think this came out. Finally, we got a sequel to Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece. And I think this movie has, it's not the masterpiece that Psycho is, but it is very, very good. A cable movie, watched it all the time, whenever it was on. You have Anthony Perkins back as Norman Bates. And dealing with, he's been released, and there are people who aren't happy about that, and they're not going to make Norman's life an easy one. And, Psycho 2. Definitely recommend that one. Just like I recommend Q the Winged Serpent. This is... The effects are better than you would think for this sort of movie, and it is about a giant dragon terrorizing New York City. Quest for Fire, a movie set like 40,000 years in the past. Primitive man trying to find fire. Obviously, there's no talking, there's no real dialogue in this, and yet you're still in tune with everything that's going on. It's beautifully shot, and a movie set that long in the past presented certain challenges, and I think the filmmakers were up to it. They did such a good job putting this movie together. And of course, Martin Scorsese's masterpiece, Raging Bull, about Jake LaMotta, Robert De Niro delivering one of his greatest performances of all time as the very complex Jake LaMotta. Yeah. Uh, Black and white. Joe Pesci's wonderful. The whole cast is great, and it's just Scorsese at the top of his game. Here's a movie that I think many of you may not have seen, directed by Milos Forman. It's Ragtime, based on Neil Doctorow's book. It combines actual events from this ragtime period, from the 1920s America, with fictional events and fictional characters. It opens with an actual murder that occurred in high society in New York. It's James Cagney's last film. Harold Rollins is so good in this. He gives such a good performance. It is an epic. It's like over 2 hours, about 2 hours and 40 minutes, but it is an American epic. And it is a movie that you will not soon forget if you see it. And if you haven't seen it, please search this one out. If I've mentioned several that I think you need to see, Ragtime would be at the top of the list. If you have not seen Ragtime, seek it out and please let me know what you think of it. But I think it is an absolute masterpiece. Reds. Warren Beatty won for Best Director for this film. I don't know that I've ever seen the whole thing. It's a long movie as well. But I've heard nothing but good things about it. I know my parents saw it when it was out, and my father said, yeah, that was excellent. So, that's one I need to catch up with. The Road Warrior, my favorite of the Mad Max films. Sequel to the original Mad Max. In Australia, it's Mad Max 2, but Mad Max never made it to the U.S., so they had to call it The Road Warrior here. It has that iconic opening, that narration, with sort of brief rundown of what happened in the last movie, and the action in this is just off the charts. And I remember in 1983 when I started high school, I was watching this movie on video. I had stopped it so we could have dinner. Our house was hit by lightning. We had a fire. It hit the electrical system and it fried all of our electrical, like our TV melted on the inside. Our ColecoVision was destroyed. When we finally hooked it up again a couple months later at this rental house we were in, you went to the left, it went up. You went down, it went to the right. It was like everything was messed up, the system. Our VCR, we could not, it was destroyed. We had to send it away, and my tape for The Road Warrior was in there. And I was begging my father to include a note to make sure they returned that tape. I don't know if he ever did, but we did get the tape back. There was a little bit of dropout from where it was sitting on the head there for the VHS, the reader. But I got the tape back, and I used to watch it all the time. I was so scared I wasn't going to have it anymore because it wasn't showing on cable anymore. I wouldn't have been able to record it. I'm so happy to have this Blu-ray of it now. Roar. Okay. This could win for strangest movie ever made. All you gotta know is here. No animals were harmed in the making of this film. 70 cast and crew members were, and that is true. It is about a couple, and it's Tippi Hedren and her real-life husband, and it has Melanie Griffith playing herself and her husband's two sons from a previous marriage, all in a house that they share with about 100 large cats, tigers, lions, and whatnot. And they brought in other cats to have that many, and some of their original cats and the ones they brought in were not getting along. They attacked crew members. Jean DeBont was a cameraman on this, and his scalp was torn off. Melanie Griffith almost lost an eye. The star developed gangrene, like I'm not remember what his name is, and you see it. You see the danger in this movie. You are scared to death for everybody making this movie. It's not a documentary either. This is a dramatic film, and I'm not going to say more. If you really want to see one of the strangest movies of all time, check out Roar. Rock and roll. This reminded me of heavy metal, but it's kind of not. It's about a futuristic society where, after the Armageddon, the only things left, only creatures left on Earth are mutated dogs, cats, and mice, and they're kind of running the Earth now. Great music. I know Cheap Trick has music in this. Lou Reed does the music for the villain. Yeah, I think if you like heavy metal, you'll like this. But if you just like rock movies, I think Rock and Roll is an animated film you're going to want to check out. S.O.B. from 1980. Blake Edwards' Hate Letter to Hollywood. It is about a director who makes I'm just throwing out numbers here, like $30 million flop, who the studio then wants to just drop him and have nothing to do with him, even though he's made them tons of money in the past. You're only judged by your latest movie, apparently, in Hollywood. But he wants to buy it back from the studio and turn it into a $40 million pornographic film, starring his wife, played by Julie Andrews, who was known for her work in children's movies. It's really Blake Edwards. I mean, the lead character in this is Blake Edwards. It's got a great cast. It's William Holden's last movie. It's got Robert Preston in it. Robert Vaughn plays a producer in this one. A really just strong cast, and it is so funny. It is such a funny movie. And if you like movies about movies, S.O.B., yeah, if you haven't seen it, you should. Scanners, David Cronenberg, that famous scene with the exploding head, but there's more to this movie than that. Yeah, cable movie for me as well, and one that, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's my favorite David Cronenberg movie, but it's a good one. It really is. Neil Simon, Seems Like Old Times. I used to watch this all the time, and it's funny, I never would catch the first half hour of it. I always seemed to see the last, like, hour plus of it. Never saw the first half hour. It took me years before I finally saw the first half hour and see this movie all the way through. And it's still entertaining. It's still funny. Yeah, and it also has Charles Grodin in it. The Shining. What more needs to be said about The Shining? Again, you can go back to a lot of episodes on Horror Movie Podcast and Land of the Creeps. I know one's our Stephen King. Winter with Stephen King, our first episode. We discussed The Shining with guests. And it's Kubrick. It's a masterpiece. It really is. And Jack Nicholson it gives an awesome performance. Shelley Duvall went through hell making this movie. And it is just one of the all-time great horror films. Shoot the Moon, a drama, Albert Finney and Diane Keaton. I don't know that I've ever seen this one, but I do want to. Silkwood, another one I had lent to Jay of the Dead, and he had returned, about Karen Silkwood, who was murdered mysteriously one night while investigating the nuclear power plant where she worked and safety violations and whatnot. Meryl Streep is excellent. Cher is excellent. I think she was nominated for, maybe not. I don't know if it was for this movie or not, but Cher is excellent in it. Kurt Russell is great. It's got a strong cast. Fred Ward, I think, plays a supporting part in this one. And it's very dramatic, and it's very tense at times as well. Simon. I remember my father, when we were watching this on cable, he goes, God, this is so stupid. He just got up and walked out. I really liked it. It's about these genius scientists who convince Alan Arkin's character that he is an alien from outer space just to study him. Madeline Kahn is in it. It's a zany film. I think Woody Allen's partner, Marshall Brickman, directed this one, and it's funny. It does have its moments. Another guy who played the father in Alf plays one of the scientists in this one. But Alan Arkin, I thought did a good job in this film. Sleepaway Camp, 1983 slasher film. It's a classic. I mean, it's one of those ones that if you're a fan of 80s slashers, you can overlook some of the deficiencies. But I don't think there are many in this one. There are some loony characters in it. There are some disgusting characters in it. But Felissa Rose stars, and, it takes place at a camp. It's like that classic slasher setting. Some Kind of Hero with Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor made a lot of comedies in the early 80s. I know with Gene Wilder, he made Stir Crazy, which is the first R-rated movie I ever saw in the theater. He did Bustin' Loose. which I always liked, and Some Kind of Hero was another one that he made. This is the one I'm least familiar with. I know Margot Kidder is in this one as well. I think she plays a prostitute. But it has some fun. I know there's a real funny scene set in a bathroom where Richard Pryor's robbing these two drunk guys in this office building bathroom, and that's funny as hell. I remember laughing so hard at that scene. But Richard Pryor, Richard Pryor is to me just he's such a great comedic. He was a great stand-up comedian, and he's a great comedic actor too. And he was good in this one. Something Wicked This Way Comes, a Disney sort of horror film. Ray Bradbury, based on a Ray Bradbury story. This, I really wish Disney did more movies like this, and they were. They did The Black Hole in the late 70s. They did, they were getting into some darker stuff there for a while. And this is one of them, and I really like this movie. I think it holds up. I know that Joel, my co-host, Gilman Joel on Horror Movie Podcast, was not as impressed rewatching this one. But I was. I really enjoyed it. Sophie's Choice, a Meryl Streep drama set in the Holocaust, during the Holocaust. I don't know if I've seen this one or not. If I have, it's been a very long time. Southern Comfort is a good sort of action thriller drama type of film. Definitely check that out. I gotta go a little faster here. I'm just looking at the time. Star 80, based on Dorothy Stratton, the model turned actress, and who was eventually murdered by her estranged boyfriend. At the same time, she was dating director Peter Bogdanovich. And this movie is about her. That's what this movie's about, and kind of an infamous film as well. Bob Fosse directed this one. Stardust Memories. This is another underrated Woody Allen film. It's shot in black and white. Woody Allen plays a celebrity, and it's sort of following through with his romances. It has a little bit of fantasy in there. Charlotte Rampling, Jessica Harper, Tony Roberts, who was a frequent co-star. This is funny and touching, and like I said, it has a little bit of fantasy. I know there's a scene where Woody Allen is talking to aliens that I really like. I like that scene. Speaking of Stir Crazy, here's Stir Crazy. I got the heads cut off folding the artwork in here, but that's Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. Two guys, sort of hapless, sort of losers, who get a job and get framed for bank robbery and end up in prison even though they're innocent, and it's just them trying to deal with prison life and eventually try to arrange an escape. I like this one. I really did. Like I said, it's the first R-rated movie I ever saw in the theater, and I just really enjoyed it. Okay, Strange Brew. I'll start off saying I love Strange Brew. I do. I taped this off of cable. I watched it all the time. It's based on these two characters, the McKenzie brothers from SCTV, from Second City. And Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas played them in the show as well. And it's set in Canada. I love it. The movie is a mess. You can tell there were giant chunks that they cut out of this film. Like that whole scene of them playing ice hockey, how did they get there? What was the point of it? I'm sure there was something that explained it and it ended up being cut out. But these two are so funny. It just, you don't care. You just want to watch the movie and enjoy it, and that's what I do. I don't try to judge it. I just sit back and enjoy it. Is this Walerian Borishwick? I think it's the Polish director. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne. I talked about him from the 70s with The Beast. And another movie, Images of a Convent, which I thought were excellent, and I think this one's just as excellent. He's the director who sort of crosses eroticism and exploitation with art house, and manages to do both of them justice, I think. And he does it again here with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne, based on and it stars Udo Kier. And he plays the character, the Dr. Jekyll. And it's about Dr. Jekyll. He's marrying Miss Osborne, and she sort of stumbles upon his secret. Stripes, one of the great Saturday Night Live movies, I think. Bill Murray joins the army with Harold Ramis and ends up facing off against Warren Oates, his drill instructor, during basic training. And maybe not totally the way it is in the Army. I'm guessing not. I know John Candy has a hilarious part in this movie as well. It's still funny, and Bill Murray's a big reason why. Bill Murray's always funny, and he's so good in Stripes, and I think the movie holds up. Gets a little bit off the wall at the end, but I don't think it's bad. I think it still sort of stays true to the spirit of the film, that last sequence where they actually end up in battle in a way. Student Bodies, an early spoof of slasher movies. Before there was Scream, there was Student Bodies, and that's absolutely true. It's more like a scary movie, I think, than a Scream. This one is just straight up comedy, but it does have, it is honest to the genre. It does present the slasher genre in an honest way. And I think if you like the slasher films, you like this one. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's entertaining and you will laugh. The Stuntman, another great Peter O'Toole performance. He plays a crazy director. He said he based his character on David Lean, who he had worked with from Lawrence of Arabia. And it's about him making a movie and how he just manipulates people, including the Stuntman. The title, I can't remember the actor's name. Damn it. And please put it in the comments. I know it. I see him, but I cannot remember his name, who played the Stuntman in this one. But another movie for people who love movies. Superman 2. This is another one. When I saw this in the theater, this is another one that the crowd went crazy. Clapping like crazy. In this one, Superman faces off against 3 arch-villains from his home planet who have come to Earth to basically take it over. I've told this story before, I'm sure, but in the later 80s when I was in high school, I used to actually plan my days sick, where I was going to stay home sick. And I actually would schedule them out several months in advance, and I would watch movies, stay home and watch movies. And every day that I did that, I started with the same 2 movies, and then, just branched off to watch other things. And those 2 movies were first Blazing Saddles, and then Superman 2. So I've seen Superman 2 dozens of times, as with Blazing Saddles. The Survivors, another early Robin Williams film about 2 guys who become survivalists. Although I don't think Walter Matthau's character is as into it as Robin Williams' character is. I think he just sort of goes along for the ride. Jerry Reed plays a crook who's trying to kill the 2 of them because they can identify him. They actually took his mask off during a robbery, and they both saw his face. So I think that's why Walter Matthau goes with... it's been a while since I've seen it, but I think that's why he joins Robin Williams to become a survivalist, but Jerry Reed ends up tracking them down there. Taps. This was filmed very close to here at the Valley Forge Military Academy in Wayne, PA. And it is a sort of searing drama about these young recruits. Their headmaster, played by Joyce C. Scott, is arrested and taken away. And they take over the academy, and they're not going to turn it over. They basically hold it hostage. They're facing off against actual troops. It has very early roles for Timothy Hutton. Not very early. Timothy Hutton, I know, was in Ordinary People as well and other movies. Tom Cruise and Sean Penn, not their first movies by any stretch, but, certainly early for them. All excellent. Tom Cruise, when he did his Oscar speech years ago, he talked about some of his great memories. He said seeing Raging Bull in Valley Forge, PA. It was actually Wayne, PA. He saw it. He had to have seen it in the same theater because this is very near Wayne, where the Valley Forge Military Academy is. And there's only one theater in that area back at that time, and that's where I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark for the 3rd time. He must have seen Raging Bull while making Taps in PA, because he mentioned that during that speech. Tarzan the Ape Man. It has Bo Derek in it. I need not say more about that. Testament was originally made for TV. It is another movie, as mentioned in my previous video with The Day After, about nuclear holocaust. You don't see the Holocaust in this one. You see the after effect, but it's every bit as dramatic and every bit as frightening as what you see in The Day After. And Jane Alexander is so good, gives such a great performance in this one. I recommend it. It's got very early roles for Rebecca De Mornay and Kevin Costner. They play a married couple in this one. They're not in it much, but it's kind of cool to see the 2 of them younger and, in an early film. Definitely see Testament. It's really, really strong. Now, Championship Season. I saw this on cable. It's based on a play, and you could tell it is a little stage-bound, I think. Very dialogue-heavy. Bruce Dern, Stacy Keach, Robert Mitchum, Martin Sheen, and Paul Sorvino. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time. Stacy Keach and Martin Sheen play brothers. Bruce Dern is a politician. Paul Sorvino is his advisor, who is also having an affair with Bruce Dern's wife. Robert Mitchum plays their coach. They were part of a championship basketball team. They get together for a weekend, and all of this drama ensues. Very well acted, I seem to recall, and I just really enjoyed it. But it's been years. I haven't seen it in a long time, and I do need to catch up with it again. Another movie I haven't seen in a long time is Thief with James Caan. Michael Mann directed this one. I remember it being excellent though. And James Caan is back at that time. I think he was, he's still a fabulous actor, and I really liked him in a lot of what he was doing back then. And Thief is no exception. And my third favorite horror film of all time. We talk about this in our best of the '80s, and I know we talked about it. We had on a horror movie podcast. We had a versus with the original The Thing from Another World, this version of The Thing, and the movie that came out in 2011, I believe, the sort of prequel to this movie. John Carpenter's masterwork, in my opinion. I like it a little better than Halloween. Halloween is my fourth favorite horror film. The Thing is my third, so just by default, I think it's John Carpenter's best work. One of the all-time great monster films, and he really captures the paranoia of these guys who are out in the middle of nowhere, just trapped, and what happens when any one of them could be the creature that's come to kill them. Time Bandits, Terry Gilliam's first film, one of his best in my opinion still. I saw this twice in the theater. My neighbor wanted to see it, and I remember I went down, I was going to see it with him, a friend of mine, and I remember his father calling me crazy for wanting to see a movie that I know everything is going to happen in it, but I didn't care. I do that all the time, obviously, but Time Bandits is one of those films that you can enjoy over and over and over again. I just watched it again last year, as a matter of fact, and enjoyed it just as much. Tootsie, one of Dustin Hoffman's most famous roles. He plays an out-of-work actor who lands a role in a soap opera by posing as a woman. And very funny film. Dustin Hoffman is great in it. Bill Murray has a role in it. He's excellent as well. Jessica Lange is really good. It was up for Best Picture, and I think rightly so. And I remember, I talked about Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy earlier. There's a bit of trivia that Dustin Hoffman showed up as Dorothy Michaels, the female character he plays in Tootsie, in drag, and flirted with Jose Ferrer, who had no idea it was Dustin Hoffman in drag. So that's kind of an interesting story. Trading Places. This is the first Eddie Murphy film I ever saw. This is the third R-rated movie I ever saw in the theater. I love it. Dan Aykroyd is great in it. Eddie Murphy is great in it. Jamie Lee Curtis is excellent. James Belushi shows up in a small role. It's the first thing I think I ever saw James Belushi in, and I'm looking and saying, boy, that guy looks a lot like John Belushi before I knew who it was. Such a funny movie. It really could be... The story could have been lifted out of a screwball comedy from the 1930s, but it's done with such sort of 80s gusto by John Landis. It's excellent. It really is. And it was shot in Philadelphia. Twilight Zone, the movie, now a notorious film. It's an anthology, 4 different directors giving sequences. The best one being the last one, which is a remake of The Terror at I don't know how many thousand feet. The original Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner, John Lithgow was in this one. It was directed by George Miller, that sequence for this film. But what people remember about this movie is John Landis's sequence with Vic Morrow. Vic Morrow died on the set of Twilight Zone, the movie. He was killed when a helicopter went out of control. He was beheaded along with 2 young Vietnamese children who were in the scene with him. All 3 of them died. And John Landis's career was, nearly ruined because of it, obviously, because he was not following the rules. They were working late at night when the children shouldn't have been working, and not following the safety protocol, as I understand it. I haven't looked into it a whole lot. I did end up seeing, I don't know where it was on the news or something, the footage of what happened, and it's horrible. You don't really see the carnage, but you see the blade come right down on Vic Morrow and the 2 children. It was really devastating. And actually, Jennifer Jason Leigh is Vic Morrow's daughter, and she was filming Fast Times at Ridgemont High at the time her father was killed. Or maybe she had just finished filming. I can't remember, but it was right around that time. Under Fire, a sort of thriller set set during wartime of photographers trying to capture what's going on. I don't know if I've ever seen this movie in its entirety, but I really want to. I know it was critically acclaimed at the time. Used Cars. For a long time, this was Robert Zemeckis' only R-rated film. It is so funny. It's about used car salesmen. Jack Warden plays the dual role of these two brothers, the Fuchs brothers. They own competing car lots across the street from each other. The one brother's a really nice guy. That's who Kurt Russell and Gerrit Graham work for. And then something happens to him, and then Jack Warden, the other brother across the street, says, "Oh, he figures his brother's dead. He wants to get his lot and kick these guys out of there and take over the lot." But they keep saying, "Oh no, he's still alive. He's around," and they start running the lot and trying to raise a lot of money so that because Kurt Russell wants to run for office and he's trying to pay for his political aspirations. And it's all going well until their boss's daughter shows up and wants to know where he is, wants to reconnect with him after all these years. So funny and bawdy and just insane. Yeah, you will laugh and laugh often with used cars. Valley Girl came out right after the three sex comedies I had mentioned before. And this one's even a little bit more than just a sex comedy. It does have sort of shades of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It's not quite that crazy of a comedy. It's more along the lines of a Romeo and Juliet. And Nick Cage and Nicolas Cage is in this one, and Deborah Foreman are great as the young lovers in this, and she's a Valley Girl. And I think Frank Zappa tried to sue this movie for rights because of his song Valley Girl. But it has great music in it as well. It's just a great sort of time capsule of the early 80s. Venom. Here is a horror/crime film that, all right, let me, it's a good movie, but what I really liked about this was the director's commentary is hilarious. The cast, okay, it's about these three criminals who take over a house with this grandfather and his grandson in it, and there is a venomous snake on the loose, so they're trying to hide out at the same time as battle the snake. And then they end up being surrounded by the police. Nicole Williamson, who played Merlin in Excalibur, is the police chief in this one. Susan George is one of the three criminals. But it's the other two, Klaus Kinski and Oliver Reed. You listen to the director's commentary on this DVD. These two men despised each other. They hated each other. They argued every day on the set. They were at each other's throat. And there's so many funny stories about how, like, the producer, one of the people who put money into the film, not necessarily in movies, but just put some money in it, brought his family to the set, thought it'd be nice to sort of tour the set with his family. While they're there, Klaus Kinski and Oliver Reed are shouting profanity back and forth at each other, just almost coming to blows. German pig, British dog were thrown around a lot. These two men hated each other. Hated him. One point, Oliver Reed said, "Is he going to stand there? I've got to walk past him." The director says, "Hey, Klaus, do you want to move?" And Klaus Kinski goes, "No, I think I'll stand right here." And Oliver Reed pushed him so far, he knocked him over. Just all this crazy stuff. It's really, the behind the scenes, I think, might even have been more interesting than the film. I wish there was some video or some film of what happened behind the scenes of this movie. The Verdict, one of Paul Newman's strongest performances, I think. It's a courtroom drama. He plays an alcoholic lawyer trying to get his career back on track. He's an ambulance chaser at the start of this. He really is. He's a guy with, like, no real morals or anything. He takes on a case that he really doesn't have a chance of winning, but then puts his all into it and really decides he's going to go for it. And it's such a good courtroom drama. And it really, I think Paul Newman, one of his all-time finest performances, was in The Verdict. He was nominated for an Oscar, did not win. He won for The Color of Money a few years later. He should have won for The Verdict. Vice Squad. I mentioned in the first video Gary Sherman. Here's the other movie of his. Scream Factory just released, or Shout Factory just released a special edition of this, and I'm tempted to pick up. It's about prostitution, and Susan Hubley plays a prostitute. Wings Hauser plays a pimp. He is such a vile character in this. It's a great performance by Wing Hauser, but you really hate this guy. And I know in this movie, the cop, played by, I think it's Gary Swanson, plays the cop. There's a scene in this where he uses a line that would be made popular a year later in Sudden Impact. "Go ahead, make my day." It's a throwaway line, and I don't think it was copied for Sudden Impact. And it doesn't have the impact of the line as it does in Sudden Impact. Like I said, it's a throwaway line in here, but a lot of people point out that line appeared in this movie first. Martin Scorsese is a big champion of this. He got in arguments over people who were calling it trash, and he said this movie is not trash. There is more than that, and he defended this film. He got into, from what I understand, he got into a pretty big argument with a journalist about it one time, defending Vice Squad. He was a big fan of it. And I am too. I think it's Gary Sherman's one of those directors. You should see his work. He also did Wanted Dead or Alive with Rutger Hauer. That's worth seeing. It's an action film with Gene Simmons playing a terrorist of Kiss. Gene Simmons of Kiss in Wanted Dead or Alive. It's not in this book, but that's worth seeing as well. Victor Victoria. I remember my parents watching this on cable. I came in toward the end of it and they were laughing so hard. It's another Blake Edwards movie with Julie Andrews and Robert Preston, who was also in S.O.B. This was his follow-up to S.O.B., and from what I understand, I mean, they loved it. They thought it was hilarious. They could not stop laughing, and I haven't seen it all the way through yet, but just based on the way they reacted to it, I want to say it. Videodrome. I don't know if I could say it's one of David Cronenberg's strangest movies. David Cronenberg has made many strange movies, but Videodrome is one of them. James Woods is excellent in it. It's about an early movie about how video and it can is going to take over the world. Images are going to become more important. Debbie Harry has a great role in this. Check it out. War Games. Saw this in the theater. Matthew Broderick plays a computer whiz. He's looking to dial on to play games. Very early, these sort of. Of course, he has to dial in. He ends up. It's improbable. What happens in the movie? He dials into the military, to the Pentagon, gets into their computer, plays what he thinks is a game, global thermonuclear war, but the computer thinks it's real. And all of these guys at the Pentagon see what's going on. They can't stop it. They do track him down. Matthew Broderick is able to escape, and he's trying to track down the guy who programmed the computer for the Pentagon. I think it's the Pentagon. I don't know if it's the Pentagon, but it's a military installation anyway, to see if he can reverse the program. It's really a thrilling film, and I still like it. I still have as much fun watching it as I did when I saw it in the theater back in '83. Where the Buffalo Roam. This is an early take on the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas with Bill Murray as Hunter S. Thompson and Peter Boyle playing the role that Benicio del Toro played in Fear and Loathing. When Johnny Depp was taking the role in Fear and Loathing of Hunter S. Thompson, Bill Murray actually called and gave him some advice and said, don't get too deep into the role, it'll take over your life. Which I thought was interesting. And so that's what this movie really is. It's an early Hunter S. Thompson film, I think revolving around the same story that Fear and Loathing did. Holy Moses, I've talked about it before. This is the first videotape we ever bought. It was $89.95. I watched it over and over again because for a while it was the only movie we had bought, and I only had a few that I had recorded. It's not good. It's not that funny. Dudley Moore, I think, is good in it. Richard Pryor supposedly showed up to the set. He only had one day of shooting. He showed up late, refused to do the lines as written, and ad-libbed everything, but he's still pretty good in it. But if you're watching it, some of what he's saying doesn't make a lot of sense. But I thought that was kind of interesting. John Houseman has a small role. Paul Sands has a small role. Madeline Kahn. Lorraine Newman of Saturday Night Live plays the love interest in this. And it's really about a guy, Dudley Moore plays a language professor. He goes on a tour of the Holy Land and he comes across a scroll. And it's about the story of Herschel. And then it goes into the past, and Dudley Moore takes the role of Herschel, who happens to be always in the wrong place at the wrong time. He hears God giving Moses his directions, and he thinks God is talking to him. There's a funny scene where he tries to put out the burning bush, but he turns every time he's setting out to do God's work, only to find Moses is one step ahead of him every step of the way. But again, it's not a great movie. The sets are kind of cheap looking. James Coco plays Dudley Moore's father, and I think that's okay. I think he does a good job. It's okay. It's just not great. I don't even know if it's really good, to be honest with you. Whose Life Is It Anyway? I think Richard Dreyfuss might have been nominated for his performance here. It is about a man who becomes a quadriplegic and wants to die. They will not let him die, and he's fighting for his right to die. It's a very dramatic film, and Richard Dreyfuss's performance is the reason to see this one. He's excellent. Wolfen, I mentioned in the previous video, talking about two werewolf movies. Wolfen is the third, or three werewolf movies is the third one. This is based more on Native American mythology, I want to say, as I remember. It has Albert Finney in it. It's a good movie. It's not quite the same type of werewolf movie as you got with The Howling and American Werewolf in London, which also came out in 1981, but it's still a damn good film. The World According to Garp. I love this movie. I really do. It's probably my favorite, one of my favorite Robin Williams movies. It's based on John Irving's novel, I want to say. John Irving wasn't happy with it. I remember reading quotes. He wasn't happy with the movie came out. They cut out so much, but I think they had to. He plays a writer whose mother is also a writer and a feminist writer. Glenn Close was up for an Oscar for this. John Lithgow might have been his screen debut. He plays an ex-football player who had a sex change operation and is now a very big woman. A quirky movie. I remember it started, the opening credits start with the song, the Beatles song, When I'm 64. And I think it's the first time I ever heard that song, and I really liked it. But this is still my favorite Robin Williams movie. And if you haven't seen it, you should. The Year of Living Dangerously. An Australian film. Mel Gibson, Sigourney Weaver, but it's Linda Hunt. Linda Hunt plays a man in this, and she won an Oscar for her performance in this, and her character really does drive the movie. It's set in Indonesia during a specific time frame when there was revolution, and these reporters are trying to capture it. And this is a very dramatic, very well-made film. You Are the Hunter from the Future. As I understand it, this was a mini-series that was then edited down into a movie. And it's just 80s cheese. If you like that kind of stuff, you're going to like The Hunter from the Future. And I like that kind of stuff. So I like Young Doctors in Love, a comedy. I remember not being allowed to see this one. From what I understand, it was a little risque. And to be honest, I still haven't caught up with it. But I put it in here because I want to see it. And the last two, Zapped. All right, Zapped, again, not a great movie. It's a sex comedy. Scott Baio, Willie Ames, Heather Thomas is in it. I will say, though, Heather Thomas sued the makers of this movie, I believe, because they have a scene suggesting she did topless nudity, and she did not. There is a scene late in the film, or early in the film, I guess, where Willie Ames has lured Heather Thomas's character in to sleep with her, and he snaps a picture with a flash, and later that picture surfaces and it's Heather Thomas topless. Well, my friends and I watching this video, and this was a movie I taped off cable, we tried to pause it in that quick little flash, and trying to get 2 or 3 frames on video to pause at a right time when you don't have frame advance back then. We were at this for about 45 minutes until we finally got it paused to see if Heather Thomas was actually naked, and no, she was not. So she definitely had a case. But I just remember that vividly. Me and my friends, we're trying to get it done before my mother got home from work, and we were finally able to do it and solve the mystery of was Heather Thomas actually topless when that photo was snapped. And we sort of ended up with Zelig, Woody Allen's film. A great movie. He shot this with cameras from the 1920s, sound equipment from the 1920s. I remember reading that it was only 60 minutes. He had to put more to it. It's so inventive, so creative. It's about a guy who can change his personality and his outward appearance based on those around him. He ends up in Hitler. He ends up around Hitler. He changes into a Native American when talking with Native Americans. And it's a funny movie as well. Woody Allen was just turning out some great stuff in the 80s. I don't have it in here, but Broadway Danny Rose is another great Woody Allen film. From that time period, and Purple Rose of Cairo was a little bit later. That might be those two might even be in the next book. I shouldn't be getting ahead of myself. Anyway, that's my look. Finally, finishing up with these films of 1980 to 1983. Took 2 parts. Took over 2 hours. Like this video if you liked it. If you want to see more videos along the lines of this one. Subscribe to my channel if you have not. This is Dave, Dr. Shock Becker. You can hear me on 2 podcasts. Horror Movie Podcast at horrormoviepodcast.com, Land of the Creeps at landofthecreeps.blogspot.com, and I will be back with more videos in the near future. Thank you.